Thank you, Shafiq, and thank you, Mitch, for the invitation. This is my first time speaking at the Congress. Certainly a different type of crowd than I'm used to speaking to, but let's see where this goes. As a member of a company that isn't a pharma company, but one that provides services to pharma, I find it interesting, intriguing, positive that the things that you're talking about as your key success factors, value, innovation, integrity, are things that the investment community is latching onto when it looks at pharmaceutical companies, specialty pharma companies, biotech companies, healthcare services companies. I will tell you a little story that would suggest maybe they're latching onto it a little too late for some investment purposes and how we got there. But before we do, I wanted to introduce Bloom Burton to you in a few slides because we're not J&J, we're not Roche, we're not Goldman Sachs, so some of you may not have heard of us. What we are is Canada's only investment bank that focuses exclusively on the healthcare sector. We've got about 20 employees directly in our company, although it adds up to about 50 when you consider some of the companies that we're seeding and building right now. But within Bloom Burton, we've got 20 people. Most of them have PhDs or MDs or JDs, and in fact we have one guy who has all three of those degrees, and he actually consults to the FDA when he's not working at Bloom Burton. So we have a depth of experience in the healthcare sector, and some of the things that we do, or not some of the things that we do, all of the things we do are on this slide. We do typical investment banking services, including raising capital for biotech and pharma companies. We also do M&A advisory when companies are bought or sold, or when pharmaceuticals, discrete assets are bought or sold. As Shafiq said, I'm head of equity research. I write research on stocks in the healthcare sector. I tell people to buy them, hold them, or sell them. A lot of people don't know what a hold means. You either buy it or sell it. But we also do monetization planning. We also do direct investing into companies. We have funds that will invest in equity in small biotech and healthcare companies. We have a debt fund that will lend to companies as well. And as I also mentioned, we are creating companies. We go into universities and take technologies that we think are good and build companies around them. We cover the whole universe of healthcare in Canada. Certainly here are some of the engagements we've had in pharmaceuticals, and because there aren't Canadian big pharma companies, we deal mainly with specialty pharmaceutical companies on the pharmaceutical side. These are some of the fundraising we've done. We've been involved in some of the largest, but also some of the smallest fundraisings in the sector, and M&As as well. And this includes, like I said, buying or selling entire companies or just bringing assets into companies, specific assets. My coverage universe is 12 companies, split somewhat evenly between specialty pharmaceutical and biotech. These are the spec pharma companies that I cover, but there's certainly more in Canada. I try to cover ones that are less covered, where there's more of an opportunity to add some value to the coverage we bring. So before we get into what has happened with the sector and what investors are thinking about it, I thought I would start with a question. It's rather a lengthy one, but I'll shorten it. When things were really good for healthcare in Canada, globally even, what do you think the percentage weighting of the sector was in the market cap of the TSX and TSXV, remembering that the big pharma companies aren't included? B. There are some smart people out there. In fact, it is B. It's about 2% in early 2014 when things were all good. The TSX and TSXV, the total market caps are about 2.4 billion. Life sciences at the time made up about 50 billion of that. Oil and gas and mining, 600 billion, or about a quarter of the index. Another question might be, why is that the case? Like, of course, we have resources under the ground in Canada, but we also have University of Toronto, UBC, McGill. We've got some great medical research institutions. But because the resources are the things that we grew up with, and we're very good at digging holes in the ground and finding out where these things are supposed to be, sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, that became an acceptable risk for the majority of fund managers in Canada. Unacceptable risk is clinical trial success or failure, regulatory success or failure. And so while there are fund managers in Canada that will invest in healthcare, it's typically not in the riskier biotechs. But what Canadian fund managers saw was that there's undeniably demographic trends that are going to drive need for better medicines going forward. They also saw that big pharma was readjusting how they looked at the world and what they did in the world, and there were areas where they wanted to be and areas where they didn't want to be, so there were assets that were for sale. The ones up here are basically big pharma to big pharma sales, but certainly specialty pharma has jumped on board as well. Also, interest rates were low, have been low, are still low, and so it makes the cost of borrowing money to buy pharmaceutical assets cheap. You also had inversions being in vogue, where companies could buy Canadian companies and reduce their taxation on the basis of that. They could relocate to other countries. Canadian investors like that. And they also saw that there was almost an unfettered ability to raise drug prices. So with all of that, the Canadians who wanted exposure to healthcare saw specialty pharma. Let's buy drugs that are already on the market, low prices, lower the taxes, raise the price on the drug as a fairly risk-free way of getting exposure to healthcare. And for a period, specialty pharma did really, really well. And you see Valiant had a market cap of 78 billion, Concordia 2.5 billion. And then this happened. Actually, two things happened. Hillary tweeted, and just before that, the Treasury Department started to shut down the inversions. Not completely, but just making them more difficult. So what happened? Looking at the bottom, this is a Bloomberg Global Specialty Pharma Index. This was specialty pharma global. It got hit pretty hard. Canada only has 4 companies in its healthcare index, Valiant being one of them. So if you actually looked at the Canadian healthcare index, it would have performed even worse. And what we're seeing now is that there's a separation of companies. Certainly, the two highlighted in red, probably they're that far down the list on their market cap to sales because of the leverage they've taken on. Knight Therapeutics has probably the strongest balance sheet, and they sit at the top. So what's next for Canadian pharma and how investors will look at it? I've got 4 options up here. Take a look, see what you think. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. In fact, I don't have an answer to this. I think that we may see a little bit of all 4 of those things. Some will delever, some successfully, some maybe not. There'll be some investment in biotech. But I think going back again to the value, the integrity, the innovation, I think Canadian investors, instead of looking at financial engineering situations, they will be looking for companies that add value. And that can be bringing drugs that exist in other markets to the Canadian market, like Paladin Labs did and Knight is doing now. That can be running some development and launching new drugs. But the other thing, the other key thing is balance sheet and balance sheet strength. We certainly saw in the previous slide that the weakest balance sheets are suffering. One other thing, the prices paid, these acquisitions of drugs, was extremely high going into 2015. We've seen the prices come down now. That'll reduce the leverage the companies incur. And then as part of being an integral part of the Canadian healthcare scene, we do have a holiday party every year and also the biggest healthcare conference, and we invite you to come to those. Thank you.